Now, the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Cogta, has handed over 1.4 billion rand to help municipalities that have to repair flood damage. Now, the Cogta Minister Velenkosini Hlabisa revealed just how much the affected provinces had received earlier today. Well, all of these provinces being Gauteng, Eastern Cape, the Free State, Northwest and KwaZulu-Natal were hit heavily by storms and flooding recently. Over 6,000 households and more than 36,000 people were affected in those provinces. The heavy rains also resulted in loss of life and even caused billions of rands in damage to property and infrastructure. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, though, because Professor Christo Coetzee from the African Study for Disaster Studies at the Northwest University joins us right now. Prof, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it for joining us here on Newzroom Africa. Let me start here, if you will. Does 1.4 billion rand make sense considering the amount of damage in the 5 provinces?
Well, afternoon, Arabile and the viewers. I would say 104 billion, I think initially sounds great, but if you consider it across all the provinces and the amount of damage to infrastructure in all these areas and the need for having new infrastructure being built, then 1.4 billion quickly becomes not a lot of money, actually. And all the money gets split up into small pieces that doesn't necessarily make a lot of difference in terms of rebuilding infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's what concerns me the most then, is because KZN received 1 billion rand around 2022 for disaster relief because of the floods that had happened in that part of South Africa as well. We don't know exactly. We haven't had the ability to account for that 1 billion rand. And now we have this 1.4 billion that's going to a similar effort, but across even more provinces. Is it adding up? Because it was 1 billion then for one province. Now it's 1.4 for 5.
Yeah, no, so it doesn't really add up. And additionally, the problem becomes is how do the officials actually, are they able to spend the money before the end of a financial year? And I think that's where one of the biggest problems comes in, how we respond to disasters is the time frame in which we have to do, for instance, an infrastructure project that takes a long time to actually plan and then to actually implement. Means that you won't spend that in a financial year, and because you don't spend that money in a financial year, it inevitably goes back to Treasury because you haven't spent the money.
Speaking about money that goes back to Treasury, I mean, let's remember actually that Treasury has said that there's an additional 4 billion that would be provisionally set aside to tackle the backlog in recovery efforts from past disasters. But we can't actually say that because that budget hasn't even been approved. So what does it look like with regards to future disasters that may happen in the country and how we react and respond to them?
Okay. Yeah, so I think with this, again, it comes back to funding, and how we're currently funding disaster risk management is kind of the wrong way around. Our legislation talks about having a proactive approach to disaster management, so actually funding risk reduction more so than disaster response. Now, even within the current budget, you would see that we're funding response more than risk reduction. So there's a disconnect with what legislation says and what the ideal situation really is. So I think for us to go forward, we have to get our funding arrangements correct and invest in risk reduction activities that helps to build a culture of safety, to build infrastructure that's more resilient to the disasters that we face.
Prof, you're ultimately saying we need to be proactive as opposed to reactive, which is exactly actually what legislation says, meaning we need to act before these disasters have happened so that everything you have to do afterwards is very minimal, as opposed to only having to react afterwards, which is what we're doing now.
Yes, so there's actually quite a famous thing within the risk reduction fraternity. Actually, the UN conducted a study on how much money you save for risk reduction versus response. So it's in terms of you invest more in risk reduction, you save $15 on disaster response, basically. So if you put that into rands and cents, you save a lot more by investing in risk reduction in the long run. Especially in the context of climate change as well. That throws another spanner in the works. We don't actually know the extent of how disasters are going to change, what the impact in future would be, it would be unsustainable just to respond to that from a financial sense, especially if we're talking about catastrophes that's more than we've ever seen before. So we have to be proactive and look at more proactive investments.
South Africa isn't a country that gets tornadoes. We don't get typhoons. We don't naturally get hurricanes, for example, all the like as well. So one would have thought we're relatively safe when it comes to natural disasters, but we aren't actually, right? And perhaps we've let this sit by the wayside. We haven't actually given much thought to this element, and now we're playing catch up. Is that the case?
Somewhat. So technically, the biggest disasters in South Africa, commonly, we look at floods and droughts. Droughts being the main one. Now, droughts mostly affect financially, more so than loss of life. So I think that's where our awareness of our disaster risk profile kind of went unseen in the past, because we've mostly been affected by droughts. Now we start to see a shift more to floods, especially in urban environments, and the damage that's causing to the loss of lives and also infrastructure. So it's becoming more of a reality. And again, as I said, climate change can bring a lot of crazy weather as well. So things like tropical cyclones, they usually now move north through the Mozambique Channel. We don't know if they can come south. The reality is there's been a lot of predictions in the past that tropical cyclones can't form in the South Atlantic, and that's affected Brazil recently, actually. So, as I'm saying, the weather's changing, and we have to kind of prepare for any eventuality.
In an ever-changing world, then, how do you prioritize? How do you redistribute funding in a case like that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I think risk reduction is a very important thing to focus on. So that would be investing in physical infrastructure, but also investing in the community themselves as well. In investing in awareness projects, building the capacity of communities to actually cope with disasters, using their own resources, trying to alleviate poverty as well, because that's a major factor in why disasters happen, why people find themselves living in areas that are very exposed. So even if you go look at the visuals from the last week in Durban, the communities affected, for the most part, our informal settlement areas are the hardest hit, because people in those areas live next to rivers due to lack of access to cheap and affordable land and also services. So poverty alleviation becomes a crucial part for actually addressing future risk as well.
Does this mean then that our management has ultimately been a key element of problem here? And this is just as my final question to really find out, because it's also about making consumers and everyday people more aware. So do we need to drive better awareness campaigns around the risks, the potential disasters that we could see in certain areas as well, making them more aware, which hopefully gets them a lot more ready?
Yeah, definitely. So that's the fundamental difference that makes a country that deals successfully with disasters and one that doesn't is what we call making a culture of risk, where it's a fundamental part of society. So for instance, like Japan, because it's a very disaster-affected country, from a young age, people are taught about disasters, how to respond to them. They build their infrastructure in such a way to deal with it. They do evacuation exercises, disaster simulation drills. And if we're honest with ourselves as South Africans, we don't do that. And again, I think it comes back to this thing that you said earlier, that we kind of think disasters don't affect us. But the reality is, in future, we will be affected more. So that has to become part of our DNA as a country to actually deal with disasters.
It's going to be a very difficult one. And I think the understanding of where this funding actually comes from, the budgetary constraints and how exactly it's allocated and who exactly got what was the big question marks then for the minister here. But Prof, really appreciate the time. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Christo Coetzee, Professor at the African Center then for Disaster Studies at the Northwest University.